Welcome to Weekly News Highlights, where we bring you the biggest stories that made the headlines this week. I'm Song Yujin, filling in for Kim Dami. South Korea and the United States held high-stakes trade talks this week amid growing tensions over U.S. tariffs. We break down what was discussed and what it means for the future of the two countries' economic partnership. Back here in the country, with just over a month to go before South Korea's snap presidential election on June 3rd, the country's two main political parties are racing to finalize their nominees. Who's likely to clinch the ticket to the presidential office? The world mourns the passing of Pope Francis, spiritual leader to more than 1 billion Roman Catholics. We look back at the legacy of the first Latin American pontiff and what comes next for the church. Trade and tariffs once again dominated headlines this week. Ever since U.S. President Donald Trump began his second term earlier this year, sweeping tariffs have shaken up global markets, including South Korea. Now, in a bid to defuse tensions, top economic officials from both countries met in Washington this week. What could this mean for their bilateral trade relations? Peunji has a story.
South Korea and the United States have agreed to produce a package of deals to remove new U.S. tariffs before the July 8 deadline, when the 90-day pause on reciprocal tariffs is lifted. This was discussed by South Korea's Deputy Prime Minister Choi Sang-mok and Trade Minister An Dok-gun, alongside U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, during a high-level meeting in Washington on Thursday local time. Seoul's Trade Ministry said in a statement that it requested exemptions from reciprocal tariffs and offered cooperation on shipbuilding and energy. Following the meeting, Finance Minister Choi said the two sides agreed to aim for a deal by early July and explained they will hold further discussions on 4 key areas of mutual interest: tariffs and non-tariff measures, economic security, investment cooperation, and currency policy.
We focus particularly on the automobile sector, which faces the greatest negative impact.
Che also said they asked for understanding from the U.S. as the negotiation process could be affected by Korea's political schedule and the upcoming presidential election. He added that the two sides agreed to discuss this in detail when Greer visits South Korea to take part in the APEC Trade Ministers meeting, scheduled to take place for 2 days starting May 15th. Meanwhile, Bessent also told reporters that the two countries had a very successful meeting, without disclosing further details on the talks.
We may be moving faster than I thought, and we will be talking technical terms as early as next week as we reach an agreement on understanding as soon as next week. So South Koreans came early, they came with their A game, and we will see if they follow through on that.
South Korea, which faces 25% U.S. reciprocal tariffs, is among the first countries the Trump administration has initiated trade talks with. Eyes are now on whether the two countries will be able to reach a fruitful deal that will exempt South Korea from higher levies. Peunji, Arirang News.
The International Monetary Fund released its latest global growth forecast this week, and the numbers show why trade policy is front and center for South Korea. Our economics correspondent Moon Hae-ryun breaks down the data.
The International Monetary Fund has sharply lowered its forecast for South Korea's economic growth amid rising trade tensions and heightened policy uncertainty. In its latest economic outlook, the IMF now expects the economy to grow by just 1% in 2025, a full percentage point lower than its January projection. The estimate was presented in the report's appendix without further commentary, with the IMF's forecast the lowest among projections for South Korea from major institutions. The Korea Development Institute forecast a growth of 1.6% for the year, while the OECD and the Bank of Korea's projections came in at 1.5%. However, the BOK said last week, following its Monetary Policy Committee meeting, that it was likely to cut its economic growth projection as it expects growth in the first quarter of the year to be lower than previously estimated. The IMF also revised down its global forecast by 0.5 percentage points. The revised outlook, with the expectation that the world economy will grow by 2.8%, reflects what the agency describes as a new high in uncertainties spurred by escalating trade tensions. In response to these volatile conditions, the IMF introduced a new forecasting method. Alongside baseline projection based on data available as of early April, the outlook includes two alternative scenarios that account for key tariff-related developments. Prior to the new tariff announcement by the United States on April 2nd, global growth was projected at 3.2%, factoring in high oil prices and U.S. trade policy. After tariff suspensions and retaliatory measures on April 9th, the forecast dropped to 2.8%, suggesting that gains from delayed tariffs are outweighed by slower growth in the US and China. The US saw one of the biggest downward revisions, with 2025 growth now forecast at 1.8%, down 0.9 percentage points, while China's growth forecast was also lowered to 4%. To mitigate the growing risks, the IMF recommended working toward a more predictable trade environment through regional and multilateral agreements, and stressed the importance of balanced monetary policy to maintain financial stability and anchor inflation expectations. 문혜련, Arirang News.
And adding to the concerns, South Korea's GDP shrank in the first quarter, the sharpest contraction in years. Shin Se-byuk reports on the factors behind the downturn and what it could mean for the rest of 2025.
According to the Bank of Korea on Thursday, South Korea's real gross domestic product, a key indicator of the economy, shrank by 0.2% on quarter in Q1. This marks the steepest contraction since the fourth quarter of 2022, when the economy hit by the COVID-19 pandemic contracted by 0.5%. It's also the first negative growth in 3 quarters. What's more concerning is that quarterly growth has remained below 0.1% for 4 consecutive quarters, something that hasn't happened since related statistics were first compiled in 1960. Breaking it down, private consumption and government spending fell by 0.1%, while construction investment plunged 3.2% and facility investment dropped 2.1%, dragging down the overall growth. Exports declined by 1.1%, while imports dropped 2%, mostly due to falling energy imports. In fact, the Bank of Korea had already hinted at a possible contraction last week. It cited several factors, including prolonged political uncertainty at home and dampened economic sentiment triggered by U.S. tariff policies. There's also the temporary halt to construction activity and a delay in demand for high-performance semiconductors like HBM chips. Given these setbacks, South Korea's full-year growth is now expected to fall short of the Bank of Korea's February forecast of 1.5%. An updated projection is expected next month after factoring in the supplementary budget currently under review by the National Assembly and developments in global trade talks. However, one expert says that these measures alone are not enough to bring about a full economic rebound.
Korea's private consumption is worth around 5 quadrillion won in sales terms, meaning it's so large that even a 15 to 30 trillion won supplementary budget would barely lift the growth rate by 0.5 percentage points. As for trade talks with the U.S., favorable terms for Seoul won't mean much if global demand remains sluggish.
To raise the growth rate by more than 1 percentage point, he emphasized Korea must revive domestic consumption, and a cut in value-added tax could be key to that effort. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
As the presidential election draws closer, both rival parties have stepped up the pace in their primaries throughout this week. For our weekly focus this week, we turn to our political correspondent Shin Hampyeong for a closer look at where things stand and what variables could shape the rest of the presidential race. Welcome, Hampyeong.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So, Hampyeong, I first want to start with the Democratic Party. So tell us how its primary unfolded this week.
Well, over the past 2 weeks, the Democratic Party's preliminary candidates have been traveling across the country as the party held regional primaries. The race began as a 3-way contest between former party leader Lee Jae-myung, Kim Kyung-soo, former Gyeongsangnam-do Province Governor, and Kim Dong-yeon, current Gyeonggi-do Province Governor. And the party's frontrunner Lee started off the week after strengthening his position as the DP's top contender, having secured nearly 90% of the cumulative votes from the Chungcheong-do and Gyeongsangdo provinces. And this week alone, the DP held 3 rounds of debates, pushing the primary race into its final stretch. And as of Friday, the remaining voting results are from the Jeollado provinces, the Seoul metropolitan area, Gangwon-do province, and Jeju, with the final outcomes expected over the weekend. And after announcing its final candidates on Sunday, based on 50% on regional primary results and 50% on public opinion polls, the party is expected to shift into full-scale election mode starting next week.
All right, so now I want to move on to the People Power Party because originally almost a dozen people signed up for the process. So how far has the party gone overall?
Well, the People Power Party had 11 registered candidates originally, but the party narrowed them down to 8. And on Tuesday, the PPP announced the first round cutoff, which was decided by a 100% open poll to have candidates who align with public expectations. And former Labor Minister Kim Moon-soo, four-time lawmaker An Chol-soo, former party leader Han Dong-un, and former Daegu Mayor Hong Jung-pyo survived after the 8 initial contestants were cut to 4. And without a clear front runner, the race is between 2 candidates who were against former President Yoon Suk-yeol's impeachment, Kim and Hong, and 2 who were for the impeachment, Han and An. The candidates faced off in one-on-one debates, 2 on Thursday and 2 on Friday. The party also scheduled a 4-way debate for Saturday. And the second round cutoff will be decided with 50% of eligible PPP voters and 50% through an open survey, with results expected next Tuesday. And if a candidate receives more than 50% of the total votes, there won't be a runoff. But if no one reaches that threshold, the final candidates will be announced on May 3rd.
Then for the DP, what are the factors to be on the lookout for?
Well, for the Democratic Party, frontrunner Lee Jae-myung's legal troubles are one factor to be considered. And the Supreme Court on Tuesday started reviewing the election violation charge against Lee as a full bench. And on Thursday, all the current justices held a second deliberation session on the case just 2 days after the first session. And this shows that the court is progressing in the case at unprecedented speed. And it also means the court is taking the case more seriously than others due to the level of public interest. Usually, Supreme Court cases are generally overseen by 4 justices. An initial guilty verdict was overturned on appeal last month. And if the top court finds issues with that ruling, it can send the case back to the Seoul High Court for a rehearing. And while this is unlikely to block his presidential run as it takes time, it could fuel a political backlash. And if there's no final ruling before the election and Lee wins, his presidential immunity could spark debate over whether the trial can continue.
And finally, going back to the PPP, acting President Han Duck-soo potentially running for the presidential race has sort of emerged as a new variable in this race. So do tell us more about that too.
You're right, Eugene. So acting President and Prime Minister Han Duck-soo's unclear stance on the presidential bid remains a key variable that the People Power Party will need to keep an eye on. And though not in the PPP primary, speculation is growing that he may run as an independent. And in such a case, some political insiders believe a merger with the conservative candidates later could shake up the race. And there are concerns that his possible run is pulling the focus away from the PPP primary. While some party candidates have voiced discomfort, others say Han's presence could still work in their favor. And if he plans to run, he must resign as Prime Minister by May 4th.
All right, thank you, Hayoung, for that update, and keep us posted on future developments.
Thank you.
Shifting focus, South Korea moved one step closer to strengthening its space-based defense capabilities this week by successfully launching its 4th military reconnaissance satellite. This is part of the so-called 425 project aimed at countering North Korean threats. Our defense correspondent Kim Bo-kyung has more.
3, 2, 1, ignition. Engines full power and liftoff. Go Falcon, go Bandwagon 3.
South Korea's 4th military reconnaissance satellite aboard the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket was launched from a U.S. space base, Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, at 8:48 p.m. Monday local time, 9:48 a.m. Tuesday Korea time. 50 minutes after liftoff, the reconnaissance satellite was placed into orbit.
and it successfully communicated with the ground station at 12:27 p.m. Korea time, indicating the satellite's normal operation.
The fourth spy satellite launched from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station successfully separated from the launch vehicle, entered its orbit, and successfully communicated with a domestic ground station, confirming that the satellite is in good working order.
The satellite launched this time was the third synthetic aperture radar satellite, part of South Korea's plan to deploy 5 reconnaissance satellites by the end of this year under the 425 project. Aiming to enhance surveillance of North Korean military activities, South Korea launched its first reconnaissance satellite in December 2023, equipped with electro-optical and infrared sensors capable of capturing detailed images. 2 satellites with SAR sensors, which enable the collection of data regardless of weather conditions, were launched last year in April and December. South Korean military is aiming to send the last one within this year, and once completed, Seoul will be able to monitor North Korea at 2-hour intervals. The country is to deploy dozens of ultra-small satellites by the early 2030s, which is expected to further reduce that interval.
Our surveillance over North Korea would be much strengthened, and after launching ultra-small satellites as well, this will mark a very important step towards self-reliant national defense, as it will significantly reduce our dependence on the US for intelligence capabilities.
While bolstering the core assets that form the foundation of Korea's 3-axis defense system, South Korea is aiming to pave the way to emerge as a strong space power in national defense. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
On the diplomatic front, South Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs condemned Japan's continued tributes at the controversial Yasukuni Shrine following Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's offering on Monday. In a statement released on Tuesday, the ministry expressed deep disappointment and urged Japan's leaders to confront their history with sincerity. The statement also followed a visit to the shrine by a group of Japanese lawmakers on Tuesday morning. The ministry emphasized that such actions undermine trust and hinder efforts to build a future-oriented relationship. The shrine in Tokyo commemorates those who died in Japan's past wars, including 14 convicted Class A war criminals. On the international front, the world is mourning the loss of Pope Francis, who died on Monday at the age of 88 after suffering a stroke and heart failure. Beloved as the people's pope, he leaves behind a legacy of humility, reform, and inclusion. Our Choi Soo-hyung looks back on his remarkable papacy.
Pope Francis died on Monday morning at the age of 88. Cardinal Kevin Farrell, the Vatican Camerlengo, announced that at 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the home of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and of his Church. Recently, Pope Francis had been treated for severe pneumonia at Gemelli Hospital in Rome, Italy, for about a month starting in February. He then returned to the Vatican and resumed his duties. Ahead of Easter, he made a surprise visit to a prison in Rome and also held a private meeting with U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance. On Easter Sunday, April 20th, he delivered a blessing message in St. Peter's Square.
Cari fratelli e sorelle, buona Pasqua. Chiedo il maestro delle cerimonie di leggere il messaggio.
On March 13, 2013, Argentine-born Jorge Mario Bergoglio was elected as the 266th Pope, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, following the surprise resignation of his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI. He became the first Latin American pontiff and one of the oldest popes in the Catholic Church's history at the age of 76.
Fratelli e sorelle, buonasera.
From his very first greeting as Pope, Francis went on to lead the world's 1.4 billion Catholics for 12 years. Since his election, Pope Francis drew global attention with his humble and modest lifestyle, wearing simple shoes and carrying an iron cross instead of the golden one. He also led progressive reforms within the Catholic Church, often clashing with conservative factions. As part of his efforts to reform the Vatican, he took on entrenched bureaucracies and emphasized the need for the Church to be more inclusive. He dedicated his whole life to supporting minorities and vulnerable groups. Last year, his decision to allow Catholic priests to bless same-sex couples sparked controversy and backlash from traditionalists. In January, he appointed Sister Simona Brambilla as the first female prefect in the history of the Vatican. Pope Francis is also remembered for his strong and consistent messages on global conflict and peace. He visited the United Arab Emirates, becoming the first pope in history to set foot on the Arabian Peninsula, and also visited Orthodox Christian countries like Bulgaria, promoting unity. He called for an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine and urged a ceasefire in the conflict between Israel and the Palestinian militant group Hamas. In 2014, he visited South Korea as the first stop on his tour of Asia, demonstrating his deep concern for peace on the Korean peninsula. During Pope Francis' tenure, 2 South Korean cardinals were appointed, Andrew Yom-soo-jung and Lazara Yu-hung-sik. Cardinal Yu currently serves as the prefect of the Vatican's dicastery for the clergy. Hampyeong, Arirang News.
With Pope Francis' passing, the Vatican has entered a period known as sede vacante, Latin for the seat being vacant, when the papal throne is officially unoccupied. Now, this period will end once a new pope is elected and formally accepts the role. A secretive process known as a conclave, open only to cardinals under the age of 80, will be held to select the next leader of the Roman Catholic Church. The conclave usually begins 15 to 20 days after a pope's death, following a 9-day mourning period and the funeral. For this conclave, more than 130 cardinals are eligible to participate out of the 252 current members of the College of Cardinals. After they've gathered at the Sistine Chapel, the cardinals will cast secret ballots behind locked doors.
What happens inside is that each of the cardinals writes on a slip of paper which says in Latin something along the lines, "I choose as Pope so-and-so." They write it down in their own handwriting, and they are encouraged to masquerade their handwriting. Then these votes are counted, and if there are enough, a new pope has been elected. If there are not enough, they go to another vote.
And a new pope is elected only when a candidate receives a 2/3 majority. Moving on to the entertainment front, YouTube celebrates its 20th anniversary this year, and content originating from South Korea has been chosen among the biggest moments in the platform's history. The New York Times marked the occasion on Wednesday with the 18 so-called biggest moments, which include Psy's Gangnam Style and the children's song video, Baby Shark. The article said that Psy released his song Gangnam Style in July 2012, and by the end of that year, it had become the first video on the internet to surpass 1 billion views. It went on to say that the Baby Shark video became the most viewed video in YouTube history in November 2020 and still holds the record with 15.8 billion views. On the cultural front, Light and Thread, the new book from Hampyeong, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature last year, topped the online bestseller list in just one day here in Korea. The new publication ranked first in sales at online stores of Kyobo Book Center and Aladdin, and third at Yes24's online store on Thursday. The total number of copies sold has not been calculated yet, but its first-day sales were much higher compared to Han's previous works, such as We Do Not Part, The White Book, and Human Acts. You can buy Light and Thread, composed of 12 pieces of prose and poetry, at offline bookstores. Finally, each year, South Korea's Hampyeong County in Jeollanam Province spreads its wings to welcome one of Korea's most colorful celebrations, the Butterfly Festival. Our Park Gun-woo gives us a sneak peek.
Busy and colorful wings flutter through the air, signaling the full arrival of spring. And there's no better place to experience it than at South Korea's biggest butterfly festival in Hampyeong County, Jeollanam Province. Celebrating its 27th edition, Hampyeong Butterfly Festival showcases around 200,000 butterflies of nearly 20 different species. Among them, the Korean tiger swallowtail has been named the Butterfly of the Year. Caterpillars, larvae, and other fascinating insects also add to the festival's charm, making it a rare opportunity to enjoy nature up close. After the festival kicked off on Friday, people from all over the country visited to enjoy not just the winged insects, but the vibrant scenes of spring.
My friends and I are all over 70, but we've been here since early this morning, feeling as excited as if we were 18 again. There are so many flowers, butterflies, and even people. It's such a joy to be here.
It's really fun to see butterflies I've only seen in books. There are so many kinds like the cabbage white butterfly that I know, and I actually got to see them today. I hope more people can come and enjoy them too.
The festival isn't just for observing, as it's filled with intriguing activities to encounter butterflies, including feeding them using floral bouquets. Nabiya, Nabiya. One of the greatest things you can try here is releasing a butterfly, so I'll be trying it myself. As I do it, I'll be sending off my greatest wishes on their wings, hoping they'll spark a new, beautiful butterfly effect. Now go, fly away. While butterfly populations are in decline globally, especially down by 22% in the US over the past 2 decades, Hampyeong has worked hard to keep its ecosystem thriving.
Instead of collecting butterflies from the wild, we raise them using selected breeding stock. To thrive, butterflies need host plants for caterpillars and nectar plants for adults. And this clean and natural area of Hampyeong offers both in abundance.
He stressed that the combination of natural resources, expertise, and sustainable practices is making Hampyeong an ideal place for both the butterflies and the festival. Offering visitors a colorful spring escape with butterflies galore, the festival runs through May 6. 박건우, Arirang News, Hampyeong.
And that's all we have for weekly news highlights for this last week of April. Thank you for watching. And from all of us here at Arirang News, hope you have a lovely weekend.